So today I'll be speaking about the Pariente family. Before I get into this actual story, I'll start by saying a little bit about the family generally. So they're thought to have come from Spain. Pariente is a Spanish word. It means a relative or parent. And in Spain, the eldest recorded document I could find was Samuel Pariente in Huesca, in the north of Spain, in 1489, who was being tried by the Inquisition. And then shortly after the expulsion, in the 1490s, we find Rabbi Jacob Pariente in Fez. Moving on from that a bit later, the Parientes seem to be already pretty important in Morocco and in the Spanish territories around Morocco. So in the 1610s and 1620s, you find in Ceuta Pariente family, and they're mentioned in Inquisition Proceso of the Almocino brothers. A little while later in Marrache was, actually, I'll show you the map here, sorry. There we go. This will make it a bit more easier. So Ceuta is just near Tetuan, and it's still a Spanish enclave today. And Marrache is just between Asila and Safi on that map. And the Spanish took Marrache in 1610, supposedly with the help of a Jew called Solomon Pariente. He worked both with the Spanish and in their favor, and also with the Moroccan Sultan at the time called Moulay Sheikh. It's said that when he made the peace treaty, he helped assist the peace treaty between Spain and Morocco. He inserted, although he was working on the Spanish side, he inserted some clauses in favor of Morocco. And it's also said about him that he was so close to the Sultan that he knew how to forge his signature. So as a recognition of his work, the Spanish allowed him to settle in Marrache. And although other Jews were also allowed to settle there, he asked to be put in his own. He didn't want to live in the Kuderia, in the Jewish neighborhood. He wanted to have his own neighborhood. So obviously, it was very powerful. And moving on a bit later, I suppose the most well-known Pariente branch of Morocco in recent history are the Parientes of Tangier. The oldest kind of modern-day bank in Morocco was established in 1840 by Moses Pariente, and they were active for about 100 years, a bit more, till 1955. And I think it's them who really established the name as a very important family, illustrious family, etc. But the bank moved away from Tangier just before the Moroccan independence in 1956. And I suppose the illustrious history of the Parientes has been a little bit forgotten. A little bit has been written about the earlier branch and about the bank branch, but today I'll be speaking about my branch and a secondary branch, which I believe which connects to it. One interesting point about the Pariente family, which I read in a book by David Corcus, who wrote about the history of Morocco, he claims that the Parientes, who were very rich, probably brought their fortunes with them to Morocco already in the expulsion. He says that he also believes the Sumbals, the Corcus, and the Benwaish also at the same time brought their riches with them at the time. I'm not really sure about the Sumbals because I believe they earned their fortunes a bit later, but I think it's definitely very plausible about the Parientes that they already came to Morocco with their fortune. So today I'm going to be speaking about my Pariente connection, and that begins with my third great-grandmother, Sol Pariente, who's the elderly lady here in the middle of this photo. The man behind her is possibly my second great-grandfather, Samuel Marrache, or his brother, Yona Marrache. And in my family, basically, we have a pretty good idea of our history, I would say. We're from Gibraltar for many generations. And, we have all these little anecdotes about different ancestors and where they came from and etc. But this name, Sol Pariente, always used to come up, especially when we used to have Shabbat meals and we used to have relatives over from Gibraltar. The story would always come up that our ancestor, Sol Pariente, she was known as Sol Pariente de Livorno, from Livorno, and that she had two sisters, and they all came over to Gibraltar together, and they married into three different families. Growing up, I was told that her sisters married into the Benros family, into the Benamor family and the Garçon family. Later on, we'll see that it's a little different. But I was always wondering about how is this Pariente family who should be Moroccan, how are they claimed to be from Livorno, and if this is even true. So when I started looking at the records available in Gibraltar, I realized that it's not exactly what's shown in the records. And I started to suspect that perhaps it was a typical Sephardic um, kind of thing of embellishing our history. You know, unfortunately, with the Western Sephardic communities, being from Morocco at the time was kind of looked down upon, maybe even till recently. So I suspect that some of these families, the moment they moved over to Gibraltar, or even to London, the history began to be embellished a little bit. So under the picture of Sol, there's the little print screen from the Gibraltar 1868 census. And you have Avraham Marrache, his son Samuel, his son Yonah, and his wife Sol. Sol being born Pariente. And she's said to be 40 years old, so born about 1828, and her place of birth is Gibraltar. So immediately this claim of being from Livorno is not substantiated. On this census, actually, living with them is a man called Yom Tov Levi, and he's claimed to be a cousin. We're not exactly sure how, but interestingly, he is also recorded as a cousin on the death record of other Pariente branches in Gibraltar. So we know there is some connection, but I haven't been able to fully put them all together. So trying to figure out who Sol is, where she came from, what we can actually find about her in the Gibraltar records. She first appears in 1846 on her eldest son's birth. You see, her name there is Sol, without a surname. And then in 1849, after civil registry began in Gibraltar, her surname is recorded for the birth of her daughter Miriam, and also for the birth of her son Yonah. And you can see that the Moel, the circumciser for both the sons, was an A Conki. I'm not sure who this was because I know that there was two Conki Moelim in Gibraltar. I believe one was Samuel and the other was Ephraim. Maybe this is Aaron Conki or Avram Conki, I'm not sure. But so here we have her surname. We see that she's in Gibraltar, but again, we need to figure out when she came. So after looking at the census and looking at the birth, I thought, okay, surely I can find her marriage, a record in Gibraltar, and learn about her parents and where she came from. So looking into Gibraltar Jewish married records that survived, there is no marriage for Avraham Marrache and Sol Pariente. Strange, but because we always had the story of Livorno, I waited a few years till Alan Nejar brought out his Ketubot of Livorno book. Very excited. I ordered them, opened them up, and of course, she wasn't there either. So they didn't marry in Livorno, and they didn't marry in London, where I've looked at the records as well. So it leaves me the thought that potentially she got married in Tetuan and Tangier. So within the story of the family, we knew that Sol had two sisters. Now, this is a print screen from a book by Jose Maria Becasis. He produced a book on the genealogy of the Jewish families of Gibraltar and Portugal. He did an amazing work using the 1777, 1791, and 1834 Gibraltar censuses, as well as the Jewish community records. Occasionally, when he didn't know something, he wrote probablemente. So if we look here, we have Avraham Pariente, and it says probablemente son of Yitzhak Pariente. Later on, we find out that that's not the case. But what he tells us is that this Avraham Pariente married a woman called Yakot, and that they had three daughters, Fortunata or Mesoda, Esther, and Sol. Now, for the two other sisters, there's also no record of their marriage in Gibraltar. So again, it tells me that they didn't get married in Gibraltar, probably weren't living in Gibraltar before the 1840s when these sisters begin having children in Gibraltar. But where do they come from? We don't know. Again, he assumes that they were born in Gibraltar. So it kind of left me in a situation that, how do I move forward? Usually the way I research very often is either looking at tombstones or finding ketubot, marriage record certificates. And for this branch, I had neither. So looking at the three sisters, Mesoda, Esther, and Sol, I had a look at who they married and who their children were to see if I could create a pattern based on the names of their children. So Mesoda Pariente married a man named Avraham. So even if her father was called Avraham Pariente, she wouldn't be able to call her son after her father's name because she married an Abraham. So we see that her first two children, Joshua and Miriam, are named for the parents of her husband. And her third child, the daughter, is called Yakot. So it gives us the possibility that maybe her mother was called Yakot. Looking at the second sister, Esther, she married a man named Joshua, who was the son of Aaron, and we see it as the first son. The second son is called Abraham, which again gives us a hint that maybe the father of the three sisters was Abraham. And they have two daughters, Beida and Yakot. So again, the name Yakot appears. Now, for my branch, my third great grandparents, Sol Pariente and Abraham Marrache, they had three children, Samuel and Miriam, both named for the parents of Abraham Marrache. And then what I think is a peculiar name appears, Yonah. It's not a very common name, I would say. Whenever it appears in various different families, usually there's a connection somehow. So seeing this name Yonah gave me a hint to think, okay, potentially these three sisters were the daughters of a couple named Abraham and Yakot. But again, Sol married a man named Abraham, so she wouldn't be able to call her child after her father and husband's name. So potentially she used the name of her grandfather. So I moved forward on the hypothesis that her father was called Abraham, son of Yonah, Pariente. But because I said there was no other records, I decided to go as far back as I could in Gibraltar and have a look what we have, and then research forward to see if I could find them. So we have the 1777 census of Gibraltar, which tells us, I believe there was about 600 Jews living in Gibraltar at the time. And under P, we find the Parientes, the Pacificos, a number of different families. But looking here from the top, we have Abraham Pariente, born in Tetuan, 58 years old. So I believe he was born around 1719, with his wife Sol, children's Yosef, Yaakov, Yitzhak, Miriam, Sete, Rachel. And then there's three young girls, Sol, Miriam, Sete, which can't be his daughters because he was married to a Sol and he already had a Miriam. And beneath them, over here, if you can see, there's Pariente AB de Yonah. So Pariente Abraham, son of Yonah, 23 years old, born in Tetuan. Now, living with them is Jane, a Negro servant, Nancy as well, and Betty. Jane is 30 years old, born in America, and her two daughters, presume her daughters, were born in Gibraltar. So it's a bit it's an interesting situation. It suggests that this family has some money to have servants. It's also quite interesting to find Black servants or potentially slaves in Gibraltar. Yes, there was slavery, but we don't see it that often in the records or in the census. So that's pretty interesting. So this is the first snapshot we have of the family. And then I wanted to move forward and figure out who these people are, what they actually did, because just with the names, we don't have much. These are more Parientes and other Pacificos. So in order to understand who that family was, Abraham with his wife Sol, all the kids, and another Abraham, younger than him, I came across a book by Louis de Chenier, who was a French consul in Morocco in the 1760s to 1780s. And in his memoirs, he writes about two brothers, Jonas Pariente and a brother that he had in Gibraltar. And he says that Jonas is working in Fedala, which today is called Mohammedia. At the time, it was a little port near where modern-day Casablanca is, but Casablanca didn't exist. And he says that Jonas has settled there after the Spanish have left, and he trades in livestock and transports it to Gibraltar, where he has a brother called Abraham, who receives it. So using this, I understood that the two Abrahams we just saw in the census, one was a brother of Yonah, and the younger Abraham was obviously his nephew, son of Jonas. So finally, I could identify a little bit of who they are and what they were doing. Looking in records from Holland, I found this is basically a printout of the discussions, I suppose, of the government at the time. In 1777, when the Dutch wanted to renew their peace treaty with the Emperor of Morocco, they were sending the letters and the financing for that via Gibraltar to Morocco. Now, the person in Gibraltar receiving the Dutch agents and the bills was Abraham, And his brother, Yonah in Morocco, who was working on behalf of the Sultan, was um, providing them information about the political situation and how to move forward. Interestingly, in this document, it refers to Yonah and Abraham, the brothers, as the Nif of Sumbel or Sumbal. Nif in Dutch, I understand, could mean nephew or cousin. So this is saying that they were family of Samuel Sumbal, the court Jew, the probably most important Jewish merchant and court Jew in the history of Morocco. So it's pretty interesting, and it again establishes them as playing quite an important role and linked to quite important families. Moving on to see what else the brothers were doing in a newspaper from London, it was a bit early in 1759. We see that there was a boat stuck in the port of Gibraltar with some goods, and Abraham Pariente was sending some stuff to London. It says cascareas, which I'm not really sure what that is, but apparently it's a certain bark of a plant. So I'm not really sure what he was trading in, but I guess different things. Moving on, in 1773, we find a mention of Jonas. So I found this document in the National Archive of Britain at Kew, and it's from Charles Logie, who was the British consul in Morocco at the time, between Tangier and Tetuan. And he's writing here a letter to the Sultan of Morocco. This is a translation that he would keep in his ledger. And he says that he has handed the letter to Jonas Pariente previously to bring to him, and that also the governor of Gibraltar had also wrote him a letter. And this was because they were concerned that the Sultan of Morocco was putting up the tax on exports from Morocco to Gibraltar, particularly on food and livestock. And of course, at the time, Gibraltar was a military garrison, and they depended on imports, particularly from Morocco. So this is a letter that Jonas took to the Sultan. And from various letters and deeds that we find in the book of Charles Logie, who was the consul at the time in Morocco, and the books of the governor of Gibraltar at the time, and they're both saved here at the National Archives, we see that Jonas and his brother were basically exporting cattle and food from Morocco to Gibraltar. Jonas was delivering letters between the Sultan and the consul, between the governor of Gibraltar and the Sultan, translating them, acting as an interpreter. And he actually did manage to convince the Sultan not to raise the taxes on the British. So even though he was working for the Sultan, he did kind of work in their favor. And this is recorded in these proceedings. So far we've got the two brothers, Jonas and Abraham. We see that Abraham was married and he had children, and then we've got the younger Abraham. So in this book called Mishpatim Tzadikim, which is basically a book of responsa, questions and answers, which was compiled by Rabbi Yaakov Halfon, I believe, but it was concerning Bet Din deeds and judgments, which had been done by a rabbi called Rabbi Yaakov ben Malka, who lived in Tetuan and I believe died in the 1770s. So it's judgments that either he wrote or that were written in his time under his Bet Din. And what it says, I think I have a part of the translation here. Yeah. So basically, the reason that this document is in the questions and answers is that a few kind of legal Jewish questions arise. But what it discusses a man named Yonah Pariente, who his first wife had died, and his 4 children from the first wife, Moshe, Avraham, Sete, and Miriam, are claiming their mother's, their right in part of their mother's dowry. So according to the Sephardic ketubah from Morocco, if the wife died before the husband, but they had children, part of the dowry that she brought in would return to her children. So this was a case discussed in Tetuan in 1772, and it now builds the family a little bit more. So we know that the young man, Avraham, son of Yonah, living in Gibraltar in 1777, had siblings, Moses, and 2 sisters called Sete and Miriam. And it also tells us that this Yonah is the son of a Moses who's still alive and the grandson of an Abraham who has already passed away. So now we've got quite a few generations, which I'll illustrate in the tree shortly. Yeah. Now, so that was one case. But in this proceeding, it talks about something that happened a bit later on. And it speaks about Rabbi Yaakov Pariente coming to the Bet Din with some documents, because Rabbi Menachem Pariente is acting as the power of attorney for these children of Yonah. And what it discusses is that basically, let me see if it's in the next page. No, yeah. It confirms that Yonah left Tetuan in a hurry and left a bunch of documents with Jacob Pariente. Jacob Pariente says he doesn't know what were in these documents, but at some point there was a riot in Tetuan, and when he came back to the neighborhood, he found basically all his documents all over the floor in the neighborhood. His house was looted. It doesn't give us a year, but I believe this is potentially around the 1790s, when Mullah Yazid, a new sultan, rose, and he wasn't very favorable to the Jews, and the Juderia of Tetuan was attacked. So in this, they discuss that Yonah, they don't know the whereabouts of Yonah. They know that last they heard about him, he had gone to Gibraltar, then he had returned to Morocco, to Marrache, and they believe that he possibly settled in Nice, but nobody knows where his whereabouts and if he's still alive or not. So in the end, the court ruled that they can't hand this dowry out because they don't know if it was actioned before or not. So that's the first mention we have of Nice. So just to illustrate a little bit from this tree, here in the middle, we have Jonas Pariente. Here are his 4 children that are mentioned in that document: Moses, Miriam, Sete, and Abraham. The rest of the family you'll see soon. And that document mentions that Jonas is the son of Moses and the grandson of Abraham. So this is already taking us into the late 1600s. Now we jump to London in 1781. So the siege of Gibraltar begins in 1779. The Spanish attack and try to take it. And some Jews have to leave. A lot of them go to Morocco. Some of them turn up in London because they were escaping on British boats who were leaving. And this I actually got thanks to the project of Ana Hebraica, who has been transcribing the records of the SMP community here in London. And it mentions 2 parientes, Jacob and Abraham, both single men, and they've arrived at a distant port, and now they're in London. And the London community made this list because obviously these Jews from Gibraltar were destitute, that they needed money to fund themselves, and they needed a way to get back to Gibraltar in the future. So we know that they're cousins, and Jacob was the son of Abraham, and Abraham was the son of Yonah. I know all the names are confusing, so sorry about that. Now, a year later, we jump to Nice. This document I got from an American researcher in Nice called Robert Levitt, and this one is in French, and it's dated the 4th of March, 1782, and it describes that a group of Jews from Gibraltar and Minorca have arrived in the city because of the siege of Gibraltar and the Spanish attacks on Minorca. It mentions that 2 of them are very rich and potentially they'd be interested for them to settle longer, and it gives them a 3 months extension on staying in the city. It also includes, in Italian this time, a list of the families that have arrived from Gibraltar and Minorca. So some of the spellings were a bit funny, and I've corrected them, or what I think they might be on the sides. We have the Gavison, El Aluf, Abdekasis, Amram, Serfati, Wanano, which nowadays in Gibraltar we call them Wahnon, the Benatad, who I believe are the Benatars, who are also my ancestors, the Ben Susan, Pariente, 7 family members, the Be'amar, who could be the Ben Amar or Ben Amor, and the Atrutel, 48 people in total. Surprisingly, I actually haven't found any of these families living in Menorca before then, so I'm not sure which families they were actually referring to, and I'm not sure which from these are the 2 families who are described as being particularly rich, and it would be favorable for them to settle. So now we jump back to London. So we know that there's some parientes in Nice, and now we jump to London, and the young Abraham Pariente that we saw just a moment ago with his cousin being destitute in London, it makes a petition to Lord North for financial assistance, and he he says basically that he's come over from Gibraltar to London in 1781. He says that he had £900 worth of goods in a storage in Gibraltar, and it was completely basically destroyed by the siege, and he's lost everything. And he's asking the British government to help him pay off some debts, help him get back to Gibraltar, Morocco. And he justifies this by going into a lot of detail about all the great and wonderful things that his father has done for the British throughout the years. Even though his father was working on behalf of the Moroccans, he continuously helped the British. And here again, he details that his father is currently residing in Nice. Within the same group of documents, which again are from the Kew archive, he has another petition, a letter that he wrote, and at the back, it was signed by Arabella Boyd. So General Robert Boyd was the governor of Gibraltar at the time, and she writes at the back that Pariente was known to the family. It's pretty interesting that a non-Jew would be writing on behalf of a Jew at the time, especially the family of the governor. So they weren't just any family. They obviously had good ties and good standing. The interesting thing I found about this was that General Boyd's family lived in a home that later on my grandparents lived in. So I found that connection interesting. Now we're going to jump back to Nice and see what they were doing there. So here in Nice, through notary archives, we managed to find power of attorney between a pariente to a conqui. Conqui is another important Jewish family from Tetuan. They spent time in Amsterdam and in Gibraltar. And we kind of knew that they spent some time in Marseille, but their time in Nice is less known. And here we have an Isaco pariente, son of Abraham. That's Abraham the Elder that we saw in 1777 on the census, giving a power of attorney to his brother Yaakov, who's in Gibraltar. And Jacob was the one who was previously just in London, and to Abraham Conqui. So he gives him a power of attorney, and it tells us that he's a native of Gibraltar, but resident in Nice. Another document we find from Nice is 1787, marriage of Miriam Pariente. So this is the daughter of Abraham the Elder, who again was on the previous earlier census. And here it tells us that Abraham has now died, that his wife Sol is actually from the family Abu Daram, and she's present. And two of her brothers are present with her, Joseph and Isaac. And she's marrying a man called Jacob Levi, resident in Nice, son of Enoch or Hanoch Levi from Genoa. And it also mentions actually his grandfather, Jacob, as well. And the dowry is quite big. £6,000 in total, and it goes into detail about all the things she's bringing in, linen and tablecloth and dress and so many things. The very nice pieces at the bottom, which I've detailed, is a diamond brooch, diamond earrings, and Venetian coinage. So this branch of the Pariente, at least at this moment, were fairly wealthy. And I know it's quite small, but if you see here what I've underlined, these are different signatures of the family: Hanoch, Yaakov, Miriam. This says Sol Pariente, but in Soletreo, Hebrew Soletreo script. So the mother of the bride could write, which is nice to see, but she wrote in Hebrew. So this is very small, but through the sorry about that, but through the records from Gibraltar and the records in Nice and other records in London, which I haven't included here because there's too much of them, we managed to really build a full family tree for this branch of the family and who they married. So they married into the Cortizo family, into the Levi bin Susan family, into the Abu Daram family. They also marry very often cousins. Parientes marrying cousins a lot. And let's continue. All right. So then the other Abraham I was speaking about, the Abraham son of Yonah, we saw him in London asking for assistance. And now here we finally see him in Nice. So in 1778, in front of a notary, he gets an emancipation deed from his father. Why he actually needed this, I'm not sure. I suppose it's something to do with business. Maybe his father was, conducting his business in a certain way, and the son wanted to conduct it in a different way, so it was beneficial for them to have some official emancipation, even though he was already an adult. From this, we learn again that Yonah, here spelled with a Giona, is the son of Moshe, who's deceased. Earlier, we saw that he was still alive in Tetuan. It says that he's a Jewish merchant, native of Tetuan, living in Nice for several years, and that he has a shop in Menton. Menton is near Nice, before Monaco. It doesn't tell us what he sells in that shop, but then he introduces his son, and it confirms Abraham, son of Yonah Pariente, also native of Tetuan, resident in Nice for 2 years. So he arrived around 1786 from Gibraltar. So we know that at some point, Abraham did make his way back from London to Gibraltar. How he did that, I'm not sure. Carry on. Unfortunately, we don't have the signatures on this document of Yonah and Abraham, because it was actually a copy made by another notary, and the notary who actually did it, Bossano, his index survives in the archives of Nice, but not his actual books, which is quite upsetting. And within the index, there's many other parientes appear. So maybe if it's ever found, there's a lot more to learn about this branch. So that Abraham, son of Yonah, is now established in Nice, and this is 6 years later. It tells us that he had a son called Moshe who died. He was 1.5 years old, and it tells us that Abraham was at the time in Menton, but his wife's brother, Yitzhak Pariente, is declaring the death. So we know that Abraham married a lady called Sete Pariente, who has to be his first cousin, because her brother is Yitzhak Pariente, who we just saw before. And here it says that they're longtime residents of Nice, and another person who declares the death of the son is Solomon Abudaram, 25 years old, also born in Gibraltar, living in Nice. And what is funny is that in the French original, he says that he is a relative of the Pariente family on his mother's side, but he doesn't know the precise relationship. And to me, I found that very funny, because that's so typical of Sephardic Jews and of Jewish families from Gibraltar. We all know we're somehow related. It could be 50 years ago, it could be 300 years ago. We're not sure, but we know that we're family. So I like that. And again, it confirms that Abraham was a native of Tetuan. A year later, he has a daughter called Sol. And here it says that he is a native and resident of Nice. So he's no longer claiming to be from Tetuan. He now claims to be a native of Nice. He has a daughter with Sete. At the time, it says that they're living in Port Limpia, which is the little port of Nice at the time. And the two witnesses are two Sephardic Jews, Simon ben Susan and Shemaya Uziel. This Simon ben Susan was from Saleh, and the Uziels were from Menorca, and they had also arrived there not too long before in Nice. And down here we can see the signature of Abraham Pariente. There's these 3 dots with 2 lines, which some people say could indicate that they were Freemasons. And you see the same thing here on the signature of Shemaya Uziel. Not sure about that, but potentially. He had another daughter called Miriam in 1799. Again, we can see his signature. Doesn't go into much detail here, but still living in the same place. Here we have his cousin. So the family is really established in Nice. They've been there almost 15 years or longer. And Yitzhak, his cousin, is marrying Sol Pariente, another Sol, daughter of Moshe Pariente and Leticia Pariente. And it details here that Yitzhak is born in Tetuan, resident in Nice, and son of the deceased Abraham Pariente. So moving forward to see if they were still living there, in 1808, obviously after the French Revolution, Jews in France were required to finally take fixed names and fixed surnames. So here we have Abraham Pariente declaring that he's keeping his first and last name, and it records him as a property owner. We also have his daughter, the one born in 1799, keeping her name. And then we've got his father, who doesn't call him a property owner, but says he's living on his own means. So he obviously has some income. And he requests not to sign because he was unable to, because he was too ill. I haven't found his signature ever on any other document. So I've been wondering to myself, was he too ill, or potentially could he not write? I'm not sure. And here is Abraham's wife again claiming that she'll keep her name. So that's 1808. A year later, in 1809, Abraham Pariente finally dies in Nice. His death is declared by Abraham Valabrega and Abraham Colonna. They declare that he was a property owner, that he was 100 years old, and he was born in Morocco, resident in Nice. And it tells us that he was the son of the late Moses Pariente and Felici Pariente. Obviously, Felici is not a Jewish Moroccan name, but potentially her name could have been Simcha or Alegria, or even Sete, because the name Sete appears quite often, and I have read once that Sete could mean happiness. So somebody here translated his mother's name, and it claims that he's the widower of a woman called Sol Embras. Now, Embras is not a Sephardic Moroccan-Jewish name. I don't know if it's a misspelling or I've read it incorrectly. I'm really not sure, but I hope eventually we'll be able to find out to figure out who her line connects to. The interesting thing I find about this, that he dies, whether he was really 100 years old or a bit younger, is relevant perhaps, but he was very old. And it seems amazing that he basically managed to retire in the south of France and die peacefully. Whereas you think about his contemporaries, like Samuel Sumbal, who died in, I think, 1790 or 1782 perhaps, and it said that he was poisoned by the new Sultan. There was two other contemporaries of his who worked for the Sultan, the Núñez Cardoso brothers. One of them was imprisoned for many years, and another one was killed by the Sultan in a gruesome way. He was ripped apart by dogs, hung, and then set on fire. There's also the De la Mar brothers. One of them got away well, but another one was also killed by the Sultan. So on the one hand, it was a good life and a good job to work for the Sultan. It was very risky. It meant these Jews had particular powers within their communities, but at the same time, their life was very risky. If they said something wrong to the Sultan, or they fell out of favor because somebody else said something, which happened very often, their life could be over in an instant. And for example, Samuel Sumbal, he did try to escape Morocco with his fortunes. He disguised himself as a Muslim and tried to escape. The Sultan's people caught him, put him in jail for a few months. He had to pay a fine and eventually was released. But somehow Jonas kind of favor was, on his side, and he did manage to escape and take his fortunes and live to an old age. Just a moment. So then the next mention we have of the family in Nice is in 1814. Now, this is surprising because it claims that Jonas Pariente is still alive and living there. That's why I don't always trust any of the documents I find. I mean, just like we saw that Abraham was declaring that he was a native of Nice, that wasn't true. This is 1814, and it's claiming that down here that Jonas Pariente is alive and he's 98 years old. And his son Abraham and daughter-in-law Sete and granddaughter Miriam are there. And it says over here on the side in Italian that they arrived after the revolution. So potentially they still were there in 1814, but that seems to be the last we see of them there. After 1814, Nice fell back into the hands of the Duchy of Savoy, so it was no longer French. And although, for example, in Livorno, Jews had a lot of rights, apparently in Nisa, they didn't. So that's kind of a reason that potentially to indicate why they potentially left. So I believe here, this is where I drop off from this branch, and I'm going to try to tie it back into my branch. I see that there's not much time left, but I'll keep on going, David. If I go over, or if it's too close, just let me know. So there was a Sidur, a prayer book, printed in Pisa in 1815 by the printing house of Samuel Molcho, and it was one of these miniature Sidurs. And what we see in one of the cover pages is that it was printed or printed with by the money of Abraham Pariente, and here it says that he is the beautiful and pleasant Abraham Pariente and his beloved and gracious sons, the brothers, who they shall never be separated, Yonah, Yosef, Yoshua, and Yudah. So forget about the other Parientes I told you about. This is a whole new potential branch. A man named Abraham with 4 sons, and he's printing this Sidur. And then in the editor of the Sidur, who's named Moshe Cohen, he goes into detail about the ancestry of Avraham Pariente, and he claims that he's descendant of Rabbi Moshe Dahan, who was from the south of Morocco, but he ended up living in Meknes, and I believe he died around 1720. And here he claims he's the great-grandfather of this Avraham. And it goes into detail how the Pariente family is a distinguished family, that they descend from the exiles of Jerusalem who were in Spain, that they're connected by marriage to the Serrero family, who was also an important family of rabbis and merchants who appear in Fez and in Amsterdam, and that they descend from the seat of the house of King David. So it makes you wonder, I mean, did they really believe this? Were they so naive? I don't know, but it also makes you wonder what power these type of statements potentially held. I mean, if you really claim these things, were you respected more in the Jewish communities? Were doors opened for you? So it's an interesting thing that the Sidur intro carries on, and the editor speaks about his own ancestor, Rabbi Khalifa Malka, who was a rabbi in Agadir who died in 1760. He was also a merchant, and you can find a number of his transactions in the Amsterdam archives. And yeah, so this editor describes him, and this editor is called Rabbi Moshe Cohen, who in other literature does confirm that he is the grandson of this Rabbi Khalifa Malka. So then we've got another document from 1815, this time Livorno, not Pisa. And this is a picture from a book that was printed in the 1920s, but this kind of looks like a ketubah, and it's not, but it was written in Hebrew. Supposedly it was written by the Chachamim, the sages of Tetuan, in the late 18th century. And in it, they describe the illustrious Pariente family, mention everything that we just mentioned before about the house of King David, etc. And it goes into detail to say that the Rif is a region in the north of Morocco, a mountain region of where Berber tribes lives, Amazigh tribes. And it says that the Rif got its name from a person called Rabbi Yaakov Pariente. The acronym, right, is Reish Yud Pei, Rif, Rip. And it details that he lived long ago, before the Muslim conquest even arrived in North Africa. Now, yeah, of course, this is not true. Potentially, there could have been a Jewish ruler in some domain in North Africa long before the Muslim conquest, for sure. I mean, things like that are documented to some extent, but this is a very fanciful story written by the Chachamim of Tetuan. And then this document is certified and signed by the Chachamim of Livorno in 1815. And you have their names here. Rabbi Ben Sarmon, again, Moshe Cohen, Chaim Bibas, Mimona Zulai, Menashe Pado, Yitzhak Cardoso. So pretty far out. I mean, I don't really know what they were thinking in 1815. And obviously this Avraham who's showing up in Livorno is really trying to demand respect through something. So trying to understand who this Avraham is, I still have a few minutes, all right. Going back to Nice, I looked at the 1822 census. There is an 1815 census, but there is no Parientes living there at the time. There's an 1822 census, which now it's in Italian because obviously it had changed hands again. And here we have an Avramo Parienti, 50 years old, widower, head of the family. And his profession is mercanti di merceri, so a haberdasher or a merchant in sewing materials or fabrics. And here in the next slide, I'll make it easier to see. So we have Avramo at the top, his wife. They're both listed as widows, so it's a second marriage for both of them. He has his eldest son, Yonah, born about 1800, and he's got a second son, Salvador, which would be Joshua. So the two first sons already match the names on the Sidur we see. And then there's another son down here called Julio or Julio, which very often could be the kind of secular name for Yuda. So that's 3 out of the 4 sons that are mentioned. In the Sidur, it also mentions Yosef. Potentially he died between 1815 to 1822, and that's why he doesn't appear here. It also shows 2 other sons who I believe that's incorrect, Mesodi and Soli. Mesodi is a name of a woman, like Fortuna or Mesoda. For a man, it would be Mesod. So I believe that's a mistake, whoever took down the census. And Soli as well, I believe, is actually a Sol, a female who's my ancestor, and we'll get to that shortly, how we can prove that. So Abraham, though, declares that he's born in Livorno. I don't think there's any way he was born in Livorno. I've looked at the Parientes who were present in Livorno at that time. He doesn't connect to them. I believe he was born likely in Tetuan or Tangiers, and again, has tried to embellish his history a little bit by claiming he was from Livorno. His wife is called Smeralda, so Italian for emerald. But at the beginning of the talk, we saw that the 3 Pariente sisters, their mother was called Yakot. Yakot is Arabic for precious gem. So it's possible that this is Abraham and Yakot, but she has changed her name to Emerald, which is pretty cute. And the eldest son, Yonah, is born 1800, whereas Yakot is born 1790. So surely she can't be the mother of Yonas because she would have only been 10 years old. And I can't really say which children belong to her, which children belong to him, but we can see that Yakot was Pariente by marriage and Pariente by birth. And down here, we also have a daughter, Esther. So that would match the 3 sisters, Esther, Sol, and Mesodi, the 3 sisters who we see later in Gibraltar. This tree is a bit more visible. So this is the tree from that census. So I put all the children under Yakot, even though they obviously aren't, but here you can see them laid out. Just a moment. Now, going back to the question, I still have some time. Going back to the question about Sol Pariente de Livorno, was she really from Livorno? So in 1826, in notary archives from Livorno, who are now held at the Archive of Florence, there's a sale of a palacete in Livorno in a neighborhood called Coteto. And this long document details the death of somebody from the Bonamici family and how through inheritance it passed to the Ferrari family, and from the Ferrari family it was sold to the Tomasi family. I'm not really sure what role Jonas plays because it's very long, and at some points it describes that there's a Jonas, son of Abraham Pariente, a merchant originally from Gibraltar, resident in Nice, and he seems to be the person facilitating the sale of this land, of this palacete, which comes with land and comes with olive groves and comes with vineyards. So it doesn't seem that it belongs to him, but he's got some stake in it. Maybe it was partly mortgaged to him. I'm not sure, but this now gives us some indication that at least somebody from the family was living in Livorno. So potentially that's where the claim came from. This Jonas Pariente, who again is the one who was in Livorno, and he was the boy we saw in the 1822 census, born 1800, he dies in Oran, Algeria in 1867. His parents are recorded as Abraham and Yakot, even though Yakot can't really be his mother, but it is recorded. His wife is Simi Abouab. She actually previously was married to an Abraham Pariente, and after he died, married somebody from another family, Cohen something. Cohen was one of the other names. And here it says he's a property owner, he's from Gibraltar, and his age about matches. Here it says he's 70 years old, so he would have been born 1897, whereas on the Nice census, he was born 1800, but surely it's the same person. This is a case about tobacco. Basically, there's a tobacco, I'll go do this very quickly before we have to finish, but there was a dispute that came to the Jewish court in Tetuan, and Yitzhak Ben Dayan is suing Abraham Pariente, son of Yonah, because he's claiming that they went into a commercial deal together to have an estanco de tabaco, and they got a license from the Basha, the ruler of Tetuan at the time. And basically, since they made the agreement, Abraham has left to live in Tangier, and then he left to live in Gibraltar for a few years. And Yitzhak Ben Dayan has been left with bad tobacco that's drying up. He's having to pay bills. Part of the tobacco, Abraham is left with a non-Jew in Tetuan, and Yitzhak Ben Dayan is not able to recover it. And it even says that Abraham's wife is still in Tetuan at the time, and Yitzhak Ben Dayan is having to take care of her. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a date, so I don't know if this is the first Pariente branch I showed you, or the second one, which is my Pariente branch. But the reason I think it potentially is my Pariente branch is because if my 3 times great-grandmother Sol, who is the daughter of Abraham, she married Abraham Marrache. Abraham Marrache's father, Samuel Marrache in Gibraltar, in the 1834 census, he's listed as inspector of tobacco. So it's very possible that this was a marriage between colleagues, both in the tobacco business, and they married their children. So that's why I suspect that it could be him. Again, this tree is a bit small, but here you see now the family that appeared in Nice in 1822, Abraham and his wife Yakot, Yonah, who married Simcha Abuab, and he died in Algeria. You've got Fortunata or Mesoda, who married the Levi Ben Yuli family, and you've got Esther Pariente, who married Yeshua Ben Ros, and Sol Pariente, my line, who married Abraham Marrache. And here's in Gibraltar. My uncle took this picture for me. This is the grave of Mesoda Pariente, who married Abraham Eben Levi Ben Yuli. She doesn't appear in the civil records, so we don't know where she was born or anything like that, but we have her grave. She died in 1855. And here we have the 2 death records of Sol's sister, Esther. And here she's called Esther Ben Ros, female, 63 years old. And where was she born? Nice, Italy. So it confirms to us that it is the same family. Surprisingly, all the descendants of this Esther who I've spoken to have no collective memory in the family of them living in Nice or Livorno. But when her death was registered, they remembered to put that. And the next death record is of Sol Pariente de Marrache, my 3-time great-grandmother. And here it records that she was born in Morocco, and she arrived in Gibraltar 60 years earlier, so around 1839. So between living in Nice in 1822, we don't know when they left Nice. They must have gone back to Gibraltar for a short period and then come back to Gibraltar. And also, there was always a discrepancy between her age. When her husband was still alive, she always claimed to be about 10 or 15 younger than her husband. After he died, on the subsequent censuses and also on her death record, she's claimed to be 94 years old, which makes her to have been born much earlier, which matches up with the Nice census. So that's talk. Sorry I rushed through it, but yeah, thank you, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you. That was a very impressive piece of work. I think perhaps not the first time that rabbis have certified something that we think is probably not true. Yeah, I first of all have a rather unfair question, because you've used so many different sources, but do you know if there are any Moroccan sources, either sort of centrally or in Tetuan, that have survived from that time, either in Morocco or perhaps been carted off to France or Spain at some point?
So a lot of the 2 Hebrew books that I used of the responses, the question and answers, they are, when they were produced, they were printed, they were produced from original manuscripts, which would have been the actual records of the Bet Din. Unfortunately, these seem to be scattered around the world, and if you follow the Jewish auctions, every few weeks you'll see a whole other Bet Din book or ledger appearing. So unfortunately, we don't have some sort of central one, especially for Tetuan. I believe a lot of the families who left in the 50s and 60s probably took them with them. But I would say that Yale University in the United States have a very good archive. They haven't digitalized any of it, but there's a lot of their Bet Din records from there. And in Tangier, we're kind of trying to work on something. Tangier Community Records they have records going back at least to 1880s, some earlier ones, but it's kind of sporadic. And we are working on putting a research center together and digitizing them. It's taking time, but it's getting there. We're also looking into, me and other Tetuanis looking into kind of bringing back copies of records to Tetuan, because they're renovating the cemetery at the moment. They've told me I can research in the Geniza if I commit to coming to stay there for a few weeks. So there is potential, but at the moment, as you know, it's still scattered.
But what about records of the actual Moroccan government itself of that period? Do anything survive?
Yes, there's a lot that survive in the National Archive in Rabat. The previous head of the archive just retired about a year ago, a very nice man. He really pushed it forward, getting modern equipment in, getting his team trained in Europe and around the world, and learning the best ways to really preserve the archive. So I don't think anything is specifically being digitized at the moment, but there's records. But you need to go there, you need to have knowledge of Arabic. And yeah, it's just a matter of time. It's getting better.
Okay, and earlier before the meeting, we were just talking about sort of DNA and genetics. I was hoping this member of the Pariente family would be joining us, but I'm not sure if they have. I mean, do you know if there has been any genetic research?
I believe that Avotenu has done at least one sample, and I also believe another DNA group has done a separate sample. And as far as I know, they don't match. If Raquel is here, potentially she can tell us something about that, because I'd love to know.
Yeah. Hi,
Raquel,
everyone.
please.
Yes, hi. Indeed, we tested two Pariente, and they don't belong to the same lineage. Both, and one of them is a very old lineage, belong to a very old lineage that matches also Ashkenazim. So, and the other one doesn't have any match. So we cannot really tell about the origin. And
do you know where they're from in Morocco? From the north or the south?
One I know,
Okay.
and he's from the south, from Imintanut, and the other one I don't know.
Interesting. Yeah, we need to get some more tested to learn more about it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Ton, you're muted.
This was an impressive talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I rushed through it, but yeah. Thank you.
If you publish the book, I will buy it.
Thank you.
I have one remark. You had this slide about the Pisa Sidor.
Yes.
And it mentions that I believe Jacob Pariente descended from the exiles. I think that should be exilar, which was the exilar was the ruler of the Jewish community in Mesopotamia. So it goes back to biblical times.
The original text of the Siddur was in Hebrew, and it refers to them as exiles. So because I made that translation, so it refers to it that the exiles of Jerusalem in Spain. So
there's another interpretation possible, I think.
Yeah, potentially.
And funny enough, the title of exilar still exists. That was it for me. Any more questions?
I'm the only Pariente here. My name is David Pariente. I'm back in Gibraltar. I just one little issue. The fanciful document, I don't think it's quite as fanciful as all that. I found some evidence from a non-Jewish Spanish historian who describes a war in the south of Spain between the Castilian king and a Moroccan sultan. And the Moroccan sultan asks for a truce of 3 days, And the king asks, why 3 days? I understand the Friday and understand the Sunday, but why the Saturday? Says, I got 40,000 Jewish soldiers in my army. And the historian explains that Morocco at that time had no Arabs. They were all
it's true.
nomads. And they used to attack
Mazir.
the settlements. And all the Jews had to form armies in order to defend themselves from these invaders. I got the book in my library. I haven't got it at hand. I'm happy to show Joshua when he comes to Gibraltar next.
Thank you. Yes, I do agree that there definitely was Jewish armies and even Jewish rulers over certain areas. I've got a couple of books here by David Korkus and Chaim Zafrani, and they both detail the ancient Jewish history of Morocco prior to the Muslim conquest, and there certainly was, Jewish ruled areas. However, was the reef in North Morocco really named after Rabbi Yaakov Pariente? I think it's doubtful, but certainly possible that there was a rabbi called Yaakov Pariente. One of the interpretations of the names actually comes from, I believe there is a town in the reef called Parientina, and that
which is now called Badis.
Mm-hmm. So it's possible.
There are also Parientes buried in Lisbon, Joseph and Abraham, who actually bought a cemetery and published books as well. And there's a Jacob Pariente in Malta, in the newer cemetery.
The Malta branch connect back to Pisa and Livorno and to Gibraltar before that, and they ended up in Tunisia. So I've done some work on them. I've got some records, but I didn't include them. But I think they're family as well.
Thank you. Bernard, can you unmute?
Thank you. I'm sorry my camera isn't working. I haven't got the bandwidth, but that was a fascinating talk. Thank you very much. I have a very general question, one genealogical question, and basically it's a query about the use of the surname from Livorno, or just Livorno. Can I start with that and say, if somebody had been born in Morocco, had moved to Livorno and came back to Morocco or came to Gibraltar, would it not be at least reasonably common for them to take the name of the last place they came from, rather than implying that they had been born there? So that was the kind of general query. The general question, which is not genealogical, but you talked in particular about people being recorded in various records, particularly in Nice, as being wealthy. And you talk about people escaping from Morocco and managing to end up rich in their destinations. And I'm always fascinated about how people who were being persecuted and driven out managed to get their wealth out. And I have a kind of question about whether or not they had already exported a lot of their wealth before they then fled to join it, rather than fleeing and taking the wealth with them. So that was the very general question. And I've got a very specific one. 1782 Nice census, I noticed that there were 4 Sarfatis. And I am looking for a Sarfati or Sarfatim link to my 10th great-grandfather, who was an Abraham Baruch Sarfati, born in 1617 in Venice. And the question is about the surname Sarfati, which implies that they were either from or had been through or had sometime lived in France. But were there Sarfatis, have you come across Sarfatis in Morocco prior to 1617? and possibly in Morocco, Nice, and other places, because I'm looking to see how this man who was a Baruch also has Sarfati in his surname, but we don't know where it came from.
All right, brilliant. So actually 3 questions that I'm really going to enjoy answering.
Oh,
so specifically in my case, Sol Pariente de Livorno, obviously de Livorno wasn't used as a surname, it was just a nickname we gave her,
okay.
But you're completely right. In Gibraltar, as well as in Moroccan communities, they attached nicknames to family names, nicknames to people, especially people who had the same name. So, I mean, you could see things like, I've seen a document from Tetuan from the 1600s referring to Moshe Macias El Gordo, because there was another Moshe Macias,
Okay.
the El Calvo, the fat one, the bald one, etc. So 100%, if somebody, you know, had returned from some place, they would be known as De Livorno or wherever they're from. So yeah, definitely agree with that. The second question or statement about them taking out their wealth before they escape could very likely be. I know that in Morocco, for many generations, obviously, for example, you see young Jewish men from Morocco working in Gibraltar for many generations, but in the census, there's a little comment saying family or wife back in Barbary. So Jews, and depending on the Sultan time, but really couldn't leave Morocco as a unit, as a family unit. So the young men or married men could leave Morocco, go work in Gibraltar, as long as they left their wife, their children, and their life, or you know, their property back in Morocco. So it was quite difficult. But I think you're right that potentially they got it out first, and I think in Yonah's case, he was lucky to potentially get out. With maybe all the craze of the siege on Menorca, the siege on Gibraltar,
Right.
you know, things were a bit unclear, and he potentially already had links with France from earlier. His associate and potential cousin Samuel Sumbel or Sumbal is known to have links with Marseille. So it's possible that they already had links. And about Serfati, so you mentioned Avraham Baruch Serfati. I guess Baruch is a surname in this case. But this Sol Pariente, her daughter Miriam Marrache married a man in Gibraltar called Baruch Serfati, son of Abraham. So I like that little connection there. But yes, the Serfati family appear in Morocco in Fez from already 1492. They come directly from Spain. There's many very long ketubot, Jewish marriage certificates of Serfati families from Morocco, which list about 10 or 12 generations, going back to a rabbi in Spain called Itzhak Hatserfati in around 1450. And then there's a legend attached to that he got his name Hatserfati, the Frenchman, because his ancestor had potentially come from France and was descendant of Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, famous French rabbi from the south of France, I think from the 12th or 13th century. So definitely the Serfati do exist in Morocco from 1492. They do exist in Spain before that. And actually, you said yours were from Venice. I'm starting to see that there was quite a bit of movement of Jews from Venice to Morocco, possibly in the 16th century. Hasn't been documented as well, but you find the same names. I mean, like the Tubi family. I'm fairly certain that Tubi family of Nice and the Tubi family that appear, the Tubi family of Venice and the Tubi family that appear a bit later in Meknes are potentially similar. There's also the Belilo family of Morocco and Belilo of Venice. I think they can be connected. Serfati, there are so many branches, also in the Ottoman Empire, that I don't know if they're one family or multiple.
Thank you. I would guess that with a name like Sarfati, they would be multiple. But thank you for that very comprehensive answer. And I'm going to start trying to investigate Fez and before. So many thanks.
Great.
No more questions? Okay.
Shall we close the meeting then? It's
yes.
ended.
Okay. Many thanks to our patrons who make these meetings possible. Without you, we would not be here on all these Sunday nights. Thank you to Jacob lively and insightful presentation. And we hope to see you all again in 2 weeks' time. See you then, and good day to everyone.
Right.
Great.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.